is a continuation on our previous tutorial on the Japanese rule over Korea from 1910 to 1950. And what we're specifically going to be looking at is the impact of the Sino-Japanese War on Korea. So in the previous tutorial, we've looked at the breadth of time from 1910 to 1950 and the economic, political, and social impacts of Japanese rule over Korea. And we're going to look at the way in which, in this tutorial, the way in which how Japanese rule over Korea changes during the Sino-Japanese War specifically. So, in a bit of a recap, you will need to have a good understanding of the paper 1 topic that we have covered, which is the move to global war, and you'll need to understand the motivations for Japanese expansion. In particular, what you'll need to recap is the invasion of Manchuria in 1931 and the causes for that particular event, as well as the outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937 and the causes and consequences of that as well. You can see here on the map that we have Japan, and we can slowly start to piece together its expansion from Japan into Korea, then into Manchuria, and then down into China. And you need to have a good understanding of the different events and the effects of those in the move to global war topic. So for this particular topic, okay, for China and Korea, what you need to understand is, okay, how the war and what consequences the war had for Korea. So in a previous tutorial, we've looked at the 1930s and the policy of assimilation that takes place in Korea during this time. And some examples of that are in 1935, we have mandatory worship of Shintoism. So this is obviously a very big challenge for monotheistic Korean Christians, who are the majority of the population during this time. In 1939, we have all Koreans required to take Japanese names. And then from 1937 to 1939, we have a progressive banning of the Korean language, moving from the government to public schools and then into the private press. These policies are somewhat effective. However, only about 20% of Koreans could actually understand Japanese by 1942. So the policy of assimilation is very slowly actually becoming a part of Japanese culture during this time. But you can think about it from a control aspect, is how it forces the Koreans to become part of the Japanese Empire. It forces them to remove their traditional worship, their traditional language, their traditional names, and makes them a part of the empire, forces them to be a part of this new expanding empire. And we can see that in the image here of the Korean children visiting the Shinto shrine in Namsan in 1930. So the expanding war in the Pacific, it's a continuation of the Sino-Japanese War, had not only a disastrous effect on the economy of Japan, but it also meant that a total war situation was evolving in Korea as well. So up until before the defeat, the Japanese government had continued to issue massive amounts of war bonds to finance its military operations. This so-called war indemnity debt, money that the wartime government borrowed from and promised to repay its people in the form of orders or contracts, accumulated. And by around 1945, is what you can see in the graph, the overall government debt amounted to 200% of Japan's gross domestic product, or GDP. The scale of the debt was obviously too huge for the post-war government to repay in full. And during the time of the Pacific War, we can see that the increased hardship on the home front, especially with the economy, meant the same hardships were faced by Koreans. We see more intense propaganda to ensure that Koreans were totally loyal, as well as total war policies on the economy, and the population were mobilized as they were mobilized into the war effort. So for men, this means that they were forced into labor, and to support the gaps that were missing within Japanese labor. Many Koreans were sent to Japan or to Manchuria or to newly acquired islands such as the Salican Islands that was acquired in 1905. These Koreans were forced to work in coal mines, military plants, munition factories, and they suffered terrible conditions under the hands of the Japanese. These were the workers in which supported the home front and they fueled the war that continued to rage in the Pacific. Many thousands died from inhumane conditions and also Allied bombing. And Koreans were also volunteered or forced to join the Imperial Army, and from 1944, Koreans were actually conscripted into the army. Some Koreans acted as prison guards for the Japanese and became notorious for their brutality, as we'll look at in a moment, as the consequences of war, and as many 70,000 Korean males died in manual labourers or as volunteers in the Imperial Army. And we have a great quote here from Mr. Kim Don-sun, who, in reference to the Korean labourers on the Salican Islands, we just went because we were ordered to do so. There was no mentioning, even when the destination was, just that we were going to work for Japan. So this complete forcing Korean men to emigrate, to remove them from their families and force them into these labor camps. We've spoken about in the previous tutorial about the impact that the annexation of Korea meant for the economy. Obviously, it had some positive effects, but a lot of the Korean businesses that flourished during this time are set up by the Japanese to support the Japanese, and ultimately, the Korean businesses are focused on supporting Japanese military. And this is evident in the decline per capita of Korean consumption of rice as was exported to Japan. And what we see in the image here is that the Korea acted as a base as well of operations for the Korean army. We see Japanese Zero fighters now in Wonsan. For women, they were forced into what is known as these comfort corps. Women were kidnapped, forced, coerced, and deceived, taken from their homes and forced to become prostitutes and serve the Japanese army. Japan claimed that they volunteered their services to the empire. However, later accounts from women challenged that assumption, and tens of thousands of women, some sources say 100,000 women, were coerced and lured by promises of economic reward into these comfort corps. And these were set up all over Japan and China, and around 3/4 of comfort women died, and many survivors were left infertile due to sexual trauma or disease that they experienced during this time. Post-war, the celebration that happened in Korea as a result of the signing of the armistice is jubilation. You can see here that a crowd that massed in Seoul Station Square cheering for the liberation of the country. This meant that their freedom as well. And for the 20% of the entire Korean population who had moved away, they could now come back to Japan. Japan's rule of Korea ended as a result of 1945, and many Koreans who had become prisoners of war were repatriated to Korea. However, there were a few that live in this grey area. They were not allowed to become citizens of Japan, even though they had been a part of the forced labour movement. And because they had supported the Japanese war effort, they were also shunned by the South Korean government. So they are sort of homeless and they have nowhere to go. In addition, 148 Koreans were convicted of war crimes. These are the men that were a part of the prison guards, and 3 of those who were convicted were sentenced to death. And we know about the brutality that the Japanese POW camps faced, and Koreans were also involved in these hideous and brutal crimes as well. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an overview of how the war itself affected the control of Korea, and starts to make you think about even more how the Japanese rule over Korea was beneficial, was it negatively impacted, and what the impacts were for Korea.